Hi guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius, and in this week's show we will be taking a deep dive into Fantasy World Dizzy. But as always, before we do, we need to have a look at this week's Amiga news. I am very happy to say that we've gained another couple of iTunes reviews. They have been very few and far between. I don't think we've had another one since October, but we got two almost at once from Stronty and Flying Elbow Drop. What an awesome name. I'm sure he's still listening. Both of them are still listening, but huge thank you to both of you. It really does help. And I'm sure there's lots more listeners out there that need to take that time and go and drop us a line on iTunes. It really does help the show out because it helps me get pushed up the charts and there's more chance of other people discovering the show and getting involved and stuff. Anyway, that's the show news out of the way. Next up is something I've noticed, well, since last week actually. I should have sort of mentioned this at the same time, but the RESHOOT R game has just released a CD version of the soundtrack. It's got 11 different tracks in total, and you can pick it up for $14.95. That's euros, not UK, and that's over on AMIGAshop.org. I'll stick a full link to it in the show notes. But I mean, the only music I've heard from this game so far has been from like the trailer and the bit of background music and stuff that's been displayed on the chap's videos. Though it sounds great, I'm quite entertained by what I've seen so far, and I'm always a huge fan of new stuff coming out for the Amiga, so yeah, well worth checking out. Next up is something that was recommended to us by 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast. He noticed I was looking into Amiga music and different apps and stuff, and actually sent me a link to a site that had tons of manuals and books and guides and even Amiga magazines, and that's retro-commodore.eu. There'll be a link in the show notes as always, and there was piles and piles of stuff on there, and these are actual Amiga booklets and manuals. You know, it's fascinating reading through some of these, and it was a complete aside to what he'd sent me, but it's just the fact that you can pick up stuff like that, because usually this sort of thing is really hard to find. So a huge thank you to him. He also signed up as a Patreon as well, so thumbs up all around. And lastly, something that was posted in the Discord chat room. As always, you can see the link to that in the show notes. But this was done by Vega DA, and it was a link to a video for the story of VFX, Amiga and Babylon 5. Now, this is a 9-minute long video. It's not the longest, though it goes into a hell of a lot of detail about how the Amiga, well, revolutionized the whole virtual effects market. I mean, everyone knows the story about the Amiga 2000s and the actual Babylon 5, like space graphics and things. It was really an amazing feat back then, and this video goes into a lot of detail about it and how it led on to things like, well, Jurassic Park and graphics and other things, and I definitely recommend that you go and watch it. So with that, I think it's time to move over to this week's game. Back when I was a kid, one of my first proper computers, I think, the one where I was really buying games for, was the ZX Spectrum, which was a +2 for me, which had that whole 128k upgrade. I played a lot of, well, crap, to be honest. There was a lot of games on there that weren't really much good. But a lot of the time I was picking up these budget titles and trying out different ones, and most of them were absolute trash, you know, they really weren't very good, and it was real hit or miss whether you ended up with something good. And just by chance, I managed to pick up a copy of Fantasy World Dizzy. I can still remember picking this up from a bookshop of all places. They had this big cardboard stand on the side of the shop when you went through the door. And as you walked in, you know, you'd always look through these fantastic covers and just pick something out at random. And I can remember the cover for Fantasy World Dizzy because it drew me in. It really caught me attention. It was an awesome bit of artwork. And I remember poring over the back about it and thinking, there's something special about this, it might be really interesting. Now keep in mind, I'd never played a Dizzy game at all up until this point, so to get something like that and to be able to take it home, and it was quite exciting, and I was just blown away by it. It was absolutely amazing, and it soon became one of my best played Spectrum games, and I kept it for years and years. I remember it being tucked away in the corner cupboard at the house. Even long after I'd gotten rid of the Spectrum, I didn't have the heart to throw that away. But later on, when I moved house and stuff, it ended up going missing, and I don't know where it ended up. It just disappeared, I'm sad to say. But I was very fond of that game. Now at the time, I did try and play different Dizzy ones off the back of this. I never liked any of the others one though, I can admit that now. I really didn't get on with the Dizzy games in general, but I think it's probably because just by chance I'd picked the best possible one, and I don't think the others were anywhere near as good, so it's quite a step back going to the others. Anyway, it was a very light dabble in there. I have a lot of high regard for this game. I had no idea it even had an Amiga conversion or port, so I was really worried about digging into this one because I didn't want to spoil my special memories of it back over on the Spectrum. Again, this is my favourite all-time Spectrum game, and I've not actually played it for absolutely years and years up until I was doing this show because I don't want to ruin my memories of it. I'm very fond of that game and I love it to bits, so I was very wary about stepping up and covering it this week. But as you guys know, I can be a sucker for punishment, so it's time to step up and cover this in detail. Now first up, it was published by Codemasters, who are very famous. I'm sure everyone knows who they are, especially if you were in the UK, because they were the big budget publisher back in the 80s and 90s. They were released some massive legendary games, but for the Amiga, they did things like BMX Simulator, Dizzy Panic, conversions of lots and lots of different Dizzy games. I think they did all of them, to be honest. Firehawk, Miami Chase, the Quattro games, which was a 4-in-1 pack that also got a NES release, I believe. Violator, loads and loads of these different cheaper titles. Now they did mix that in with some more expensive ones, but most of their bread and butter I think was based around this budget market. Now the developer for this port was Optimus. Now they did games like Big Nose, I don't know what that is, Pegasus, Pro Boxing Simulator, Seymour Goes to Hollywood. That's a very weird Dizzy-like game. It's almost like a rip-off, but it's by the same company. I'm not entirely sure what the history is behind that, though I do hope to cover it one day. I'm sure we will find out. Now, this came out in 1991. It was on one floppy disk, single player game, and priced at the budget price of £7.99. The codie behind it was a chap called Andrew Green. He'd worked on Action Fighter, Axel's Magic Hammer, what an awesome game name, Dynamite Ducks, Sword and the Rose, and Torvak, which I think someone made a request for several months ago. It's one I'm digging into, I've got that at the back of my mind. Graphics wise, chap called Terry Lloyd, again he worked on Action Fighter, Carve Up, Dynamite Ducks, both Rick Dangerous games, Skids, etc. He did a fair few titles for the Amiga. Music-wise, we got the infamous Alistair Brimble. He also worked on Psygnosis's, Agony, the Alien Breed games, all the Team 17 ones, things like Goal, Lion King. I've not covered that yet ever. I do want to dig into that one at some point. Primal Rage, Star Trek the 25th, I think, is that Judgment Rights, or is it Rights of Judgment? I forget. It's a graphic adventure anyway, a very good game. Something I need to cover at some point in the future. Man, I am getting a bit excited, aren't I? We've not even dug into the history yet, have we? The Amiga port is an updated version of the original 8-bit game, as I said before. It uses extra screens and it has more collectibles included. Not forgetting the vast update to like the graphics and the sound. You know, this really takes advantage of the, well, sort of takes advantage of the Amiga. This is a Dizzy game. It's not going to be like Super Mario 64 appearing on an NES. It was the third title in the main Dizzy series, with Philip and Andrew Oliver working on it, though with this one originally they really wanted to push the boat out compared to the previous Dizzy games, which were more contained, you know, being on an island in much smaller areas. With this one they really wanted to expand the game world and go overboard with the design, though it would be the very last Dizzy game that they ever created entirely by themselves. Now, they aimed from the start to make this better than the previous games and really push to improve every aspect of it, with better locations, actual characters which Dizzy hadn't even met before. So they decided to create actual friends for Dizzy to actually meet, and this sort of gives it this extra touch of humour throughout, which none of the other games had. They also aim to have as few buttons to press as possible, because just having another would make it twice as complicated. Right from the start, they decided that Fantasy World Dizzy was not going to focus on any sort of combat, as the pair wanted to really push the puzzles for this. Rather than have, like, say, simple choices, they decided to chain puzzles together, whereas before it was simple pick up and drop items, you know, link one item together. In this, it could link one item with several different solutions, and it would also act like a chain, which they did mainly because they wanted to make the game more and more interesting. But by limiting how much Dizzy could actually carry at the same time, it meant the player would have to really consider the best way forward and which path to go around, you know, where to leave the items throughout the different parts of the land. And it also meant the player wasn't running around the world as much as you were before. It could be more focused. It was up to the player to decide. At the start of the game, Dizzy was locked into a prison cell with a very easy solution on screen, meant to actually train the player how the game world actually works and how to deal with situations. But the idea for the room actually came from the BBC's Castle Quest, so they did nab the idea slightly a little bit from something else. I am of course getting all this from multiple different interviews, but when it came to actually carrying objects within the world, the Oliver twins were very worried about how silly it would seem for Dizzy to be able to carry objects like, well, cows. So they actually tried to get around this by calling it a pygmy cow, so it was, you know, it's a really tiny fairy-like cow, which seemed to sort of trick people, and it just meant it looked less silly when you were sticking stuff in Dizzy's pocket. Though whether that actually fools people is, I think it's down to the individual player. Basing the game around a fantasy world and lots of different tales, i.e. stuff like Jack and the Beanstalk, meant that they were never actually lacking for ideas, but it did help them drive the overall story for the game. Again, this is Fantasy World Dizzy, remember? And doing stuff like using a bucket to grow beans, magic beans rather, to create the beanstalk seemed like a natural fit for the game. And of course it makes for a rather neat puzzle. When it finally came to releasing the game, bear in mind this was coming out for Christmas time for all of the 8-bit systems, it turned out to be a bit of a sales monster, certainly not what they were expecting, and I think it ended up being one of their best-selling Dizzy games, at least for that one at the time. They both look back on this one with a lot of pride, as it was a huge achievement for them personally, and they do say that this was one of the best games they ever worked on. Keep in mind, I just bumped into this game by accident in a shop, and just from playing it, all these years later, what, 25, 30 even years almost? My god, I am old. I still love this game to bits. It stands out as something really, really awesome, so they really were onto something special. Now, ports-wise, this came out on the Amstrad CPC 464, of course the Atari STE, Commodore 64, PC, which I'm thinking will be a DOS port, and the ZX Spectrum. When it comes to the game's story, weirdly, despite being based in a fantasy world, it's all told within the game itself. There's not much of an actual, even a bit of blurb in the manual beyond the fact that you need to get out there and rescue Daisy from the wizard, which I think it's Zack up in the castle, or is it Zack's? I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, the point of the game is you meet different characters, they give you little tasks to do, swap about and stuff, and you have to make your way to the main castle and then rescue Dizzy's girlfriend. When the game first opens, you actually get to see poor old Dizzy being thrown into the castle dungeon. Now of course, being an egg with hands and feet and an Indiana Jones hat on top of his head, although having said that, it's more of a safari one. It's a very, very odd looking hat. You can see a few things dotted around the screen, like a jug of water to pick up, which you can use to throw on the far off fireplace. You can also grab some stale bread to feed the rat in the rafters. Very, very simple puzzles to solve, and it's a great way to practice how to actually play the game and see how it all works. Now, along the top of the screen, there's this huge rock which shows off the number of lives, the points and coins you've collected, as well as displaying the actual room name that you're in, or the area, depending on how you look at it. I almost forgot, but there's also side art of Dizzy and Daisy looking at you, but I suppose in a way the parted lovers have been drawn apart. Don't worry, this is still safe for children. The controls are quite straightforward, with up for jump and fire to pick up or use an item. When you grab them, the items are just dropped into a text inventory. It's not like, say, Monkey Island where you can see icons and stuff on the screen. Now that starts with just 2 slots for things you can pick up, but luckily it can be expanded later on if you manage to find the right item. Now you can place items anywhere on the screen, and the good thing is they don't just return to the original spot, say if you die or leave that area. It means you're always trying to plan where you actually put stuff, and you need to remember it for when you come back later. Now, Dizzy himself doesn't jump like, say, Mario, and oddly he rolls like, well, a tumbling egg. Bear in mind, he is an egg. He spins through the air into this weird sort of arc, I don't know how else to describe it, with a fair bit of gravity kicking in. Now this will take some getting used to. It sounds very odd as I describe it, but it does become second nature the more and more you play. The more you get used to it, you'll be flinging them around the screen like crazy and being able to time the jumps just right. It does come to you, I will promise. But again, you are in that starting area where you can practice all this. There's no death from jumping through the air, unless you leap into the fireplace, of course. But you got to behave yourself. Even though he is an egg, he does not smash when you land on the ground. Placed around the world are randomly spread gold coins. There's 30 in total, and it's best to collect them as you go along, as you will need them to complete the game. If you haven't got them all when you get there, you basically talk to Daisy. Oh, is that a spoiler? I'm not, no, sorry, whoops. But basically she will tell you, oh, I need all these coins, go and collect them. The coins can be in some really difficult places to actually reach, and I guess it does extend the game a bit. It definitely gives you a good reason to explore for sure. When it comes to the game's puzzles, I will say that these are all item based and none of them are really too taxing. There is a couple of head scratches in there when you need to link, say, one item to multiple things throughout the world. Luckily, when you've finished something, I think, and you don't need it anymore, it just disappears. You can be carrying a lot of these things around the world for an awful lot of time, so it's just the best to keep a note of stuff. Make sure you remember where you've kept it. Maybe set a screen aside to use as the dumping ground, or just have a couple of screens so you're not easily getting lost or forgetting where you've put things. All of these items really do tie into that fantasy theme though, and it works really, really well. Everything here is from the original game, and the Amiga update, it's mostly about the graphical flair, but they have thrown in a thing like a few extra secret bonus rooms, as well as some items that give you extra points. It's not much, but I suppose, say, for a fan, it's a fun little extra that will give you something else to explore, especially if you're used to the world. Even back then, I'd have loved to have tried this on. Again, I had no idea this even existed, because I'd have probably loved the opportunity to play a different version of it. One of the first things you will notice with the graphics for this is just how bright and colourful it all is compared to the black and red of the specky version, especially what I was used to. They've really gone to town with the graphic. Lots and lots of like new detail with actual backgrounds behind the screens. Again, it's not just like one colour or black. They really have put some extra effort in there. really does feel like they've turned the lot up to 11. And I was pleasantly surprised at just how good this all looked, especially for a budget game. They've even added things like death animations and lots of cutscene art, which the original definitely never had. Won't win any prizes, of course, but it's a neat little touch and it's a great way to expand on the original. Throughout the game, there's a good, catchy tune playing throughout every part of it, though it is only a few minutes long and it's always playing on repeat. It's whether or not you like that tune and get along with it. There's also a really awesome opening track with all of the yoke folk dancing away on the main screen when you first start it off. You will get bored of the music, obviously, after a bit, but luckily they've stuck a button in there to turn it off if you want to. When you do, it just plays sound effects instead. And for things like Dizzy's leaps and action, it's very, very awkward. It's like grunts and noises and stuff. It's not the best, so you probably end better off leaving the music on. That grumble also sort of leads us into the problems for the game. Now, either the music is too loud and you can't actually hear the sound effects, or there's just no music and FX together. I wasn't entirely sure about that. If you actually turn the music off, you can hear things, like I said before, with the grunt of Dizzy leaping about, which is fine. It sounds alright for the part, but if you go back to, say, the original Specky, the Amstrad or whatever versions, there's this awesome boing noise as Dizzy leaps around the screen. It's all gone, and I'm not entirely sure why they removed that, because I have fond memories of that from the game, and it's like Mario's leap sound or Sonic's jump and spin, you know, they have certain sound effects to them, and it's very weird that this has been removed, and I'm not entirely sure why. I couldn't see any way to adjust that in the options to put it back on. It's just disappeared, so you might be a bit disappointed with that. Now, going on to the backgrounds, I did say it's great that they've got lots of different ones there, but one problem which sort of occurred to me as I was reviewing this and trying to cover it properly, going on to the black backgrounds of the Spectrum version, in my mind, I always thought the entire game was actually set at night, especially as all of those torches everywhere with flames on, and these are all throughout the world and on both versions. Yet it's the middle of the day and the sun's out and it's bright and breezy and blue and everything, and it was just a bit weird coming to this and having that fond memory of this nighttime games with all the black backgrounds, and it's just completely gone. It's all in the daytime. This is more of a personal gripe, I think, rather than a complaint. I mean, I just couldn't accept the difference. I'm just being odd. Maybe, you know, I'm just being daft. What can I say? I also noticed when I was playing that there's some very weird scrolling slowdown in parts of the game, especially like when you're leaping in different areas. Say you're also jumping from one screen to another and it switches over. It really slows down in parts of it, and I'm not sure why it's like this at all. But I had a look at the ST version just for a similar comparison. I didn't play it, I haven't got an ST, but I ended up watching it on YouTube, and it does seem to have the same issue. It's very, very odd, because this sort of a game, it's not exactly taxing for the likes of the Amiga, you know, especially it's a port of an old 8-bit game. They should have been able to sort that or do something a bit better. Again, it's not a major issue. It does happen from time to time though, and it's a bit of an annoyance really for something like this. One other thing that really stood out to me whilst I was playing this, it's the Treasure Island Dizzy painting. Now, in the Spectrum port, when you escape from the castle dungeon and you go up and you see like the staircase to the throne room, there's a huge picture on the background. If you stand underneath it and press fire, it will show the loading screen from Treasure Island Dizzy. Now keep in mind that the Amiga did get a port of that. I think that came out before Fantasy World Dizzy. It's just very odd that they've not ported anything over or done anything with it, because I'd love to see like a gorgeous Amiga version of that artwork, you know, all done up in full colour and stuff. Again, not really a problem, just personal preference there, booting its way through. We do, of course, need to have a look at the magazine reviews. Now, weirdly, there's not very many of them, I think because of the time when it came out. First up is Amiga Force, who gave it 84%, Amiga Action 82%, and Amiga Joker 73% as well. None of them are really amazing scores. It's getting quite up to the high end, I suppose, though. They do seem typical for what is a remake of a budget game, and for an upgrade of an original 8-bit, this really is like stellar stuff. It changes enough to improve on the original, and yet it still feels like a well-deserved budget game, and that's what an odd thing to say. It adds just a little bit extra on top, changes enough, and it's not going to last you forever for sure, but whilst it does, there's an awful lot of fun to be had in exploring this world and meeting all the different characters and solving all of the puzzles and seeing the fantasy elements and things like dragons. Yes, there's dragons in this. That's a whole other side of it. That's a lot of fun. But again, this is a budget game. It does feel like a budget game, and you've got to expect that with the amount of content that you get. When it comes to actually meeting the characters though, I mean, the humour from actually talking to them, it's awful, like it's silly, it's fun, and happy to say you can still kick good old Dylan into the ocean. It's one of my favourite parts. Now, I would never have imagined the character art that they've gone and put into this. Again, I'm playing this from the original game's perspective. They've really gone to town with this. They look great, bright and colourful, and it fills the screen. It's a huge plus for fans, though I just don't get the slowdown that it suffers from. It's not enough to be a problem, like I said before, though it can stand out at times. It's just one of those real annoyances whilst you're playing. Though I really did enjoy overall what they've done with the game, especially in look and feel, though my biggest gripe has to be Dizzy's hat. It just doesn't work for me. It never existed in any of the 8-bit versions, and yes, that I get that it's taken from the box art. You've probably seen it by now. I've used it for the show cover. It just looks weird. It just doesn't suit Dizzy at all, especially when he's bouncing around through the world. And whilst we're grumbling, yes, there's more. Why the hell is Denzel dancing? Denzel doesn't dance. He's just too cool for it, and you see him there in front of the fireplace bopping away, and I'm just like, that's not Denzel, that's just wrong. They've gone a step too far. I will say that this game overall felt like returning to an old haunt and still seeing something new. The 8-bit gameplay has come across as it should, and the fancier look of everything, it really makes you appreciate the extra effort they must have put in to get this to all come together. You know, these improvements are really good. I've really enjoyed them. It must have done really well for them because the other Dizzy games were soon to follow. I think they all came out about the same time or within a few years, with similar conversions done to them, all with like the same graphical updates and extras. Though I'm going to have to admit that I've never really played further than Fantasy World Dizzy. I have over the years gone back to the earlier versions and dabbled in the others, but none of them have had anywhere near as much time put into them as this game. Again, it's going back to my specky love for it. I completely forgot to mention this earlier. It turns out there was like a CD32 compilation of all the Dizzy games on one disc. What an awesome thing that must have been to buy at the time, all them games on one CD. It's something I'm definitely going to have to pick up when I finally get me greedy mitts on a CD32 console. I'm really looking forward to it because I want to play them all now. Again, the excitement from going back to this, and it set me off again, and I want to get more and more involved in Dizzy and his world and see the rest of the adventures, I suppose. It has been long enough. It's about time I started playing them all properly. And sadly, it's time to bring this week's show to a close. Of course, if you've any comments about anything I've said today or what you've heard, you can drop me a line at Lorfarius@AMIGArama.com. We also have a very active website with all sorts of stuff on there. It's well worth having a look. I'm also pretty active over on Twitter, which is at AMIGAramaPod. I try and post on there on a daily basis, as well as get involved in all sorts of different retro gaming discussions. It's not all just Amiga stuff on there. I would like to take a moment to send out a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters, and they are 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast, who just joined us recently. He also has a very decent YouTube channel, so it's well worth looking up. Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford, who also does a YouTube show called Casual Retro Gamer Weekly, Jason Warnes, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Premski, Retro Ravi, Richard Legg, Sneff and Treble. Thanks for listening, and until next time, guys.